Let's start with the main concepts of React. What I would suggest is going through the documentation first before you start coding. What that will do is you will have an idea of what it's going to be when you're starting to code, and that's really important. So to create a React application, we need this. The smallest React example looks like this. So we would have a React DOM, and then React DOM I think is just a variable that we could just call .render function on it. So you can think of it as a class, and then we just call the class method of render function. It takes in as the first is an HTML file or like an HTML string, and then the second thing is a get element by ID. So it displays a heading saying hello world on the page, and you can try it on CodePen. So I think we can do it here. This is what we have, an HTML file which has the ID of root, and then we have very small JS file which has react DOM.render, and it does, and it will just print out hello world. So I think it takes a reference of the React root basically. So document.getElement by ID will pass in this div. From what I can think right now is React will only work inside this div. So it's going to use this as its scope. Okay. So now let's come back to how it's going to be, how to read this guide. So this guide is designed for people who prefer learning concepts step by step. If you prefer learning by doing, check out the practice tutorial. So as I said, I prefer learning concepts first before implementing it, because then what would happen is you will just learn half of it and you will start implementing it, and then you will get stuck. And then you would realize that what I needed to solve my problem was coming in the upcoming guide sections here. Okay, knowledge level assumptions. React is JavaScript library, so we'll assume we have a basic understanding of JavaScript language. I don't have a basic understanding. I would say I have a more advanced of it. So I hope it's going to go fine. But if you guys don't understand anything, just let me know. I'll explain it through. If you don't feel very confident, we recommend going through a JavaScript tutorial. All great, you can do that, and it might take you between 30 minutes and an hour. But as a result, you won't have to feel like you're learning both React and JavaScript at the same time. True, good thing. Bravo, claps. So one thing I would say that when I started to do JavaScript, or when I started to create my first application, I didn't learn about JavaScript. JavaScript is so damn easy. If you have worked with any of the language before, Java, Python, even C++, C#, C, if you have worked with any of the languages before, you can understand JavaScript in no time. JavaScript is very, very simple. There are a few concepts that you need to learn, need to understand, but I'll cover that later. Yeah, this is for if you have learned JavaScript and you don't know about ECMAScript 6, and I hope that if you know JavaScript, you will know that, and if you don't know, then I'll cover that when the time comes. Okay, I think introducing JSX, this is the hardest part. Not the hardest part, but what makes React. This is what it is. So consider this variable declaration HTML equal to h1 tag, and that's very confusing because it's not going to allow you to do that. But this funny tag syntax is neither a string nor HTML. This is called JSX, and it is a syntax extension to JavaScript. We recommend using it with React to describe what the UI should look like. JSX may remind you of a template language, but it comes with full power of JavaScript. Okay, so it's a tag, but it's also JavaScript. JSX produces React elements. We will explore rendering them to DOM in the next section. Okay, why JSX? I actually went through all of this and them till the state and life cycle. So I'll quickly point out the important parts of it. Okay, yeah, something called as components. Something that you guys need to know. This will apply to most of the things. So it will apply to Angular, it will apply to React, it will apply to basically any modern JavaScript library, which is called components. Components are reusable things that you can develop. So say like a card here. This card can be a component, and this card can be another component, and this card can be another component. So this card can be called as card component. What it will do is it will have a very small job, a very specialized job. It would be just to display this image, have this button here, have the description here, the title here, the same way here. So it's really important to think of your application as it's built of smaller components. That's it. So you would have your navbar as one component, you would have this page as one component. We will discuss what we can make it into a component and what we should not make it into a component later. Okay, but that's the whole component logic, that anything that can be reusable, anything that is repetitive, you can create a component and you don't have to write the code again and again. You can just use a common component for that. Write it once, use it multiple times. That's the whole point of components. So that's what it says, that it concerns with loosely coupled units called components. So it tells you about this components. So components have very specific task to do. Embedding expressions in JavaScript, or not JavaScript, JSX. In the example below, we declare a variable called name and then we use it inside JSX by wrapping it in curly braces. So you have a constant name and then you have like a string interpolation of name here, and then you render the element, you pass in this JSX and you pass the root. So this is going to be the same root, and then this is going to be element. So element here is going to be some JSX tag that you have, and it's going to have a name. Yeah, I think that's all. This h1 is going to get rendered with the name of Josh Perez. I think so. So let's find if it does that or not. So you can put any JavaScript expression inside the curly braces in JSX. For example, 2 + 2 user.firstname. So we have this curly braces. So anything inside this will be treated as a JavaScript. Okay, so you can have anything here. You can have a function as well, format name. Okay, so that means this will have a global scope. I have declared say name here, let name is equal to 1. Then whatever like I can use this name in anywhere in the JavaScript whole application. That's the global scope of JavaScript. So that's very contradicting as how Angular works. Angular wants to keep everything very coupled and very compact, or you would say protected from the real world. Okay, good to know. So that means you can create a JavaScript function in a different file as well, include that in your head and use that function that you have declared in that external file and use it here. That also something that you can do. Good to know. In the example below, we embed the result of calling a JavaScript function format name into an h1. So this now we have just a defined format name function, and then you can use it here. So if you see here, we are just calling this react.dom.render here. The HTML didn't change at all. So don't worry about this HTML part. We see that user, we see element, and we pass in the element. The element has a function here, format name. The format name function has been defined up the top, and then it will return username as concatenation of this object. So first name, last name, add those together with the space. That's what we are getting here. So you can do Duskblade and gaming, and you will find hello Duskblade gaming here. Great. JSX is an expression too. After compilation, JSX becomes a regular JavaScript function calls and evaluate to JavaScript objects. This means that you can use JSX inside of if statements and for loops, assign it to variables, accept it as arguments, and return it from functions. So here what we are doing is we are returning a JSX, because after this is compiled into plain JavaScript, it's going to be a string. I think that's what they are telling us. So they become regular JavaScript function calls. So you can return it. So basically that part. You don't have to just define it. You can return it as well. Specifying attributes with JSX. So if you think if you know h1 would have an attribute of say align or size or font size, something like that. How can you define that? So we have a, and then href is an attribute. How you can define it, you can just type it out here, just like an HTML thing. You may also use curly braces to embed JavaScript expression in an attribute, so you can have the URL coming from a variable here rather than just a hard-coded string. Don't put quotes. Okay, this is like something that I like. If they tell us about something that you should do and should not do. Don't put quotes and curly braces when embedding a JavaScript expression in an attribute. Don't put quotes around the curly braces. Okay, you should either use quotes for string values or curly braces for expressions, but not both in the same attribute. Why? Because how the parser will go to know that okay, this whatever comes up in between these quotes, it's going to be this, like a string, or you need to execute this. Since JSX is closer to JavaScript than to HTML, React DOM uses camel case property naming convention instead of HTML attribute names. True. For example, class becomes class name in JSX and tab index becomes tab index with I capital. So remember, every time you need to use src, I think src is going to remain src, href might remain href, but that class becomes class name and tab index becomes tab index. We'll see more examples below. Specifying children with JSX. So, child tag. A child tag is something which does not, no, this is not, this is a single tag. Image tag does not have a closing one, so it does not end with slash image at the end. So you can have nested tags as well, no issues. Okay, so what this says is you could have anything, like you are writing title here, right? Imagine I just wrote a JavaScript code which will break your whole website, and when this gets executed your website breaks. So what React has done is make it sanitize. I think this is called HTML sanitizing or script sanitizing. Okay, let's read through it. By default, React DOM escapes any value emitted in, yeah, so basically if it's going to render here, it's not going to execute a script, so that's good. Okay, objects compiles down to react.create element calls. These two examples are identical. What this says, either you can create an element which is a function which returns the value h1 and h1, or you can do a react.create element, or okay, it will automatically do it for you. Babel is a library or a JavaScript file which is the compiler for React. It's not just for React, it works for, I think, anything, any JavaScript file it works for. These objects are called React elements. You can think of them as descriptions of what you want to see on the screen. React reads these objects and uses them to construct the DOM and keep it up to date. Rendering elements. How are you going to render elements? An element describes what you see on the screen. True. Unlike browser DOM elements, React elements are plain objects and are cheap to create. React DOM takes care of updating the DOM to match the React elements. One might confuse elements with the more widely known concepts of components. We will introduce components in the next section. Elements are what components are made of, and we encourage you to read this section thoroughly before jumping ahead. True. So element is some anything of a tag, okay? HTML code, we can call it like that for now. Rendering an element into the DOM. Let's say there is a div in your file, div id is equal to root. We call this root DOM node because everything inside it will be managed by React DOM. To render a React element into a root DOM node, just pass both to React DOM.render. So we have not okay, we have seen React DOM always, right? React DOM. We need to pass the reference of it and also the element that we want to render, and it is going to render it. Okay, updating the rendered element. React elements are immutable. Yeah, so if you think of this case, hello Harper Perez, if you want to update it, how are we going to do that? It's going to tell us that. So React elements are immutable. Once you create an element, you can't change its children or attributes. An element is like a single frame in a movie. It represents the UI at a certain point in time. Okay, it's immutable. To explain immutability, I have to go into too much detail. We'll cover that later. With our knowledge so far, the only way to update the UI is to create new elements and pass it to React DOM.render. Okay, to update it, what this is going to do, this is a function tick, and that ends here. Okay, then at set interval tick 1000. So after this is a set interval function, guys. So this is a JavaScript function. It takes two things. It takes a function call and it takes the time seconds that you want to execute it from. So after 1000 milliseconds, it's going to call this function. So it's going to first execute this line, it's going to go to the next line, it's going to wait for 1000 milliseconds, and then it's going to execute. So it's going to go here, and we'll see that it's just declares a constant here, and then it sends that constant to be rendered. And what is the part of it which gets rendered is hello world, and it is new date to local time stream. Oh, it's a set interval, not set timeout. Okay, my bad. So this means that this is set interval, means after for every 1000 milliseconds, so that's 1 second, it's going to call this tick function. So what should happen is whenever this is getting rendered, like here, if you see, it's going to change every second. It's going to update it every second. If we didn't do a set interval, we did a set timeout, it will just do it once. React only updates what's necessary. So it compares the elements and its children to the previous one and only applies the DOM updates necessary to bring the DOM to the desired state. So if you see h2 is not getting changed, h1 is not getting changed, div is not getting changed, only this part is getting changed. Okay, this h2 is getting changed. Oh, not even that, I guess. It only affects this small string, not or not. It doesn't even affect the full stop below. Only this small string it's going to update. That's why React is quite performant. Even though we create an element describing the whole UI tree on every tick, only the text node whose contents have been changed gets updated by the React DOM. In our experience, thinking about how the UI should look at any given moment rather than how to change it over time eliminates a whole class of bugs. Components. Cool, components. And components let you split the UI into independent reusable pieces, as I said, and think about this just talks about the components here. Function and class components. How do you create a component? The simplest way to define a component is to, I'll do this. I don't have that extension here. This function is a valid React component because it accepts a single props. So we have a function here, welcome, and it takes in an argument props, and then there's a props.name and it returns it. So it accepts a single props, which stand for properties, object arguments with data, and returns a React element. We call such a components function components because they are literally JavaScript functions. You can also use an ES6 class to define a component. Okay, this is a class. Something that was added in the ES6 format was classes. Before that, JavaScript didn't have classes, so it was a game changer because now you can have classes, you can have inheritance, etc. So we have a class welcome which extends to the React.component. So React.component must implement one render function. That's what's happening here. We have a render function here, and it takes in this .props.name. So this .props.names, that means you need to pass this .props somewhere. Let's see how they do it. How you can pass when you're calling function here. Okay, maybe when you call create the class using new, then you can do this .props. Okay. Rendering a component. Previously we encountered. Okay, so this is a component. Okay, I completely forgot about it. This is a component here. So welcome is now became a component. So previously we encountered React elements using the DOM tags div. However, elements can also represent user-defined components. So welcome name Sarah. When React, we pass in the name. Wow, this is good. We can pass in the props because here we see that name. We have props.name. It's just going to use the attribute as the properties. Good to know. So when React sees an element representing a user-defined component, it passes JSX attributes and children to this component as a single object. We call this object props. For example, this code renders hello Sarah on the page. So we have an element welcome Sarah, and we have props element. You have defined a component here, and then you have just used it as here. I see. So you need two things. You need a class or a function, and then you need the JSX of it, and then you need to pass it that JSX. Good to know. Let's recap what happened here. We use the render welcome component Sarah. Okay, great. Always start components with a capital letter. React treats components starting with lowercase as DOM tags. Example, div represents a HTML tag, but welcome represents a component and requires welcome to be in scope. Got it. Always use capital letter. Got it. Composing components. Components can refer to the other components in their output. So yeah, components are very independent. So they interact with their surroundings by inputs and outputs. So they will refer to their components, to other components as their output. This lets us use the same component abstraction for any level of detail. A button, a form, a dialog, a screen in React apps, all those are commonly expressed as components. For example, we can create an app component that renders welcomes many times. So we can have welcome. This is a component because we know any function is just a component. Any function that returns something is a component. It returns a JSX as a component. And then this is also a component, welcome. This gets defined first, then this gets defined second, and voila, it works. Then you can just render the app here. Ooh, wow. So no need to now do a const element equal to app. You can just pass in the app like this. Good to know. Typically, new React apps have a single app component at the very top. However, if you integrate React into an existing app, you might start bottom up with a small component like button and gradually work your way to the top of the view hierarchy. Extracting components. Don't be afraid to split components into smaller components. True. For example, consider the comment component. We have a div, then we have a div here, then we have an image here, and then we have a class name of a div here. And it's getting complicated, right? I think this is what they are going to say. It accepts author as an object, a text, string, date as props. So properties.author.name. So author it requires, and it requires text, and it requires date. that's its input, and describes the comment on the social media website. This component can be tricky to change because all the nesting, and it is also hard to reuse individual parts of it. Let's extract a few component. Oh, like a few parts of it as a component, but no, multiple components. First, we will extract avatar. So if you see avatar here, it's just an image. So I think what they're going to do is just create this image as an avatar. So it will have a URL and a name. So if you see, it is still accepting user. So it now only has a input of user. So doesn't need to know that it's being rendered outside of inside a comment. That's the main part. That those are very independent and isolated. So it doesn't care where the input comes from. Should it come from a comment, or should it not come from a comment, or should it come from the nav bar? It doesn't care. Yeah, so that's the whole point of having components. This is why we have given its prop a more generic name, user, than author. So an author is a user, right? So it works, and it becomes more reusable here. So very, very important, very good best practice. And if you guys are working on any production level code, I would say always name the inputs as what they are going to do in isolation. So don't name it something like author. And this is going to happen a lot of time. You will see so many people, so many like 3, 4, 5, 6 years of experience people making the same mistake. When they create a component, they name the inputs as what it's going to do for that particular thing. So if I create a card here, I will not call it a card, I will call it a game. This will become a game, this becomes a game, this becomes a game. But this should not be a game, because this is just a card. It doesn't matter if this is used in a game section or not. So very, very important to use neutral names which are independent with the with the parent component. Basically, we recommend naming props from the component's own point of view, exactly, rather than the context in which they are and it is being used. In a complex sentence, you can sum it up in one line. We can now simplify comment a tiny bit. So now we have replaced this avatar here, and we are passing the user, and this user now comes from props.author, which makes sense. Now class name, comment text, props.text. I think we can extract this comment text and comment date as well. Now we will extract a user info component. This whole part, no, this user info, okay, I see, this part into a component that renders an avatar next to the user's name. So it will have a name and an avatar. I see. This lets us simplify comment even further. So it just becomes user info has now avatar in it. It becomes smaller. Extracting component might seem like grunt of work at first, but having a palette of reusable components pays off in larger apps. True, I've seen this multiple times. A good rule of thumb is that if a part of your UI is used several times, like a button, panel, avatar, or is complex or enough on its own, like app, feed, story, comment, or anything like that, it is good candidate to be extracted into a separate component. So if you think of this page as a component, we can create a whole page like this becomes a component, and this also can become a component. What is very common between both of them, you see, it has a full screen layout, and then it has a button, so that can be created into a component. A component is where we can use the reusable code. I say that we don't need to create a component if we don't have too much reusability of it. If you want to create a component of these 3 social media buttons, that's also fine. You don't need to create a component for only one icon, even though it's good to create it, even though it's very, very good to create it, and I'm going to create it as a component. But you can, in theory, do it, like create one for this bar and use this bar again. Props are read only. Okay, props are read only. Whether you declare a component as a function or a class, it must never modify its own props. Consider this function sum. Sum returns a plus b. Such functions are called pure functions. I really love pure functions. Such functions are called pure functions because they do not attempt to change their inputs and always return the same result for same inputs. So it really talks about that if you do sum, it's going to return something and it's not going to mutate A or B. It's very important to have pure functions because when you reuse the code, you know for a fact that okay, what I'm getting is a new result and my result is not going to be changed. Because in JavaScript, we have this as an issue where you pass in an array and it does some calculations on that array, like say filter, and when you try to use the same variable array somewhere else, the value has been changed of that array. So it's like, because everything is a reference in JavaScript. So having pure functions, really good. If you want to do some operation like a filter on an array, do a filter on an array by creating a first copy of it. Filter always creates a copy, by the way, so don't worry about it. Don't worry about the filter, but there are things such as push, pop, don't do it, because that will mutate the original array. Such functions are called pure function. In contrast, this function is impure because it changes its own output. So yeah, it's changing account or total as some value, which is really bad. React is pretty flexible, but it has a strict rule. All React component must act like pure function with respect to their props. Got it, sir. Of course, application UIs are dynamic and change over time. In the next section, we will introduce the new concept of state.